right, what the Destroy Trump media is now doing is beyond malpractice. The Destroy Trump media has now worked themselves into a frenzy over the president's comments about the chaos in Charlottesville. Here's what the president said yesterday. Take a look.
I've condemned neo-Nazis. I've condemned many different groups, but not all of those people were neo-Nazis, believe me. Not all of those people were white supremacists by any stretch. You had a group on one side and you had a group on the other, and they came at each other with clubs, and it was vicious, and it was horrible, and it was a horrible thing to watch. But there is another side. There was a group on this side, you can call them the left, or you've just called them the left, that came violently attacking the other group.
Both sides, whether we like it or not, this is an important point. The First Amendment does protect even hate speech. It's why even the ACLU defended these white supremacists and their right to say what they want to say, whether or not we like it or not. You are not allowed in America under the rule of law to get into fistfights, to punch people, engage in fighting because you don't like what they say. Now, despite those facts, the media is living in an alternative universe. Why? Because all they want to do is destroy the president.
Say the most controversial thing in the world, and if you find fault with this, you're brain dead. All lives matter, and we condemn all violence. Those are bad words? Where are those bad words? What planet are you from?
Okay.
We condemn all violence. That's what President Trump said, and all lives matter. If you don't agree with that, you're a racist.
Okay, so
the most striking thing is how well organized it was. There was people doing crowd control. There were people dropping people off at specific locations. There was security. There were people handing out extra tiki torches. Everyone who was there knew exactly what they were signing up for. Nationalist groups.
And when the president says that there were good people at this march, that they were quietly there to protest a removal of the Robert E. Lee statue, that not all of them were neo-Nazis or white supremacists, what do you think? Is that true?
No. Everyone who was there knew what they were doing. They were shouting, "Jews will not replace us." It was very well coordinated. They had an order to the chants. Like, there was no mistaking. There's no innocent person wandering up and accidentally getting involved in it, just as a human being.
In terms of the president's comments yesterday, I'm wondering how they're being perceived by some of the neo-Nazis, the white supremacists, the white nationalists that you've been speaking with.
They love it. The president continues to exceed the expectations of white nationalists. One texted me last night, "My God, I love this man. He really has our back."
So even though the president,
I mean, they are taking cues from them.
even though the president said, I condemn.
Rallies are being planned in a lot of blue cities, San Francisco and Berkeley, California, for this month. Plans for opposing rallies there are already forming as well. And this weekend, Boston is bracing itself for what could be a confrontation between some of these controversial far-right groups that are organizing what they call a, quote, Boston free speech rally, and the counter-demonstrators that are expected to show up as well. Joining me now is the mayor.
White nationalists actually praising the President of the United States yesterday for his words, and why not? He has now officially become the president of the white nationalist, not only of America, but also of the white nationalist movement. David Duke saying, "Thank you, Mr. President, for your courage to tell the truth about Charlottesville."
Yesterday via Twitter and elsewhere, let there be no confusion. This was deliberate terrorism. You stand by that?
Absolutely. I don't know if the authorities here have used the word terrorism yet. There's a judicial process which will play out. But it was clearly perpetrated by one of these racist Nazis who came to Charlottesville to spread their vile ideology. And he targeted this crowd very clearly. There's no question of anyone who witnessed it that his intent was to cause a mass casualty incident. And it's a domestic terrorist incident as far as what I witnessed. I want to second guess the incredibly difficult job that the authorities had here yesterday when a federal judge granted permission to a group whose very existence is violent, is based on an ideology of hatred that wouldn't allow certain classes of people to have rights or to exist even. The legal authority let them come to a very compact, tight part of town. The police had a very difficult job to do. Once the state of emergency was declared, they moved in very quick to disperse these crowds.
To begin with, our group was looking at the
association of language and rhetoric used by different groups such as the common everyday individual, different political leaders, religious leaders, even the media, and how that related to the violence that was seen in the Charlottesville incident. However, as we started to look at that more, we noticed a different direction that we could take with it that didn't.
Yeah, and that new direction just had a lot to do with that community discovery and interview process that we were conducting. And time again, we began to notice that a lot of the way that people were talking about these questions we were asking them, the Charlottesville riots, violence, and religious violence, we saw a link to where they got their news source and the media that they were really paying attention to. And this became a very interesting point for us to continue to examine, just because it linked a lot to our class discussion on the media and the way the media influences people's views, both on just the everyday events that are occurring and political violence. So we decided to keep following up on those interviews, and in our opinion, it showed just a great connection between where those primary news sources were coming from and people's opinions on violence, religious violence, and the Charlottesville violence. So the interviews that you guys are about to see are kind of 3 examples of where this research led us. So enjoy them.
The people that protested the protest were being somewhat hypocritical. The right to protest is one of the rights that every single citizen that in the United States has. And although the message that they were sending, the white supremacists with their riot is not a great message, it's still freedom of speech, and anyone has the right to that. So the fact that people decided to come in, and obviously the people that decided to protest that also have the right to do that. This is a free country, but at the same time, these are people that obviously believe in the right to protest because that's what they were doing. So they felt that other people should be protesting for what they believe in, which that was the problem, I think. Any story I think that the media decides to cover always kind of persuades public opinion. It depends on how they portray it. And obviously, whenever they portrayed it, it was talking about the white supremacy rally and how these people, then there was a protest against that, and then fights broke out. But I think from what I can remember, I think they really made it seem like it was kind of on the people that were protesting for white supremacy. They kind of made it seem like those were the people that made things get violent, when in reality they were just trying to use their rights as citizens to protest something that they want, and other people decided to come in and cause problems. I think it shows that people are willing to fight for what they believe in. If people that showed up for that protest obviously have something against that, I mean, I feel like probably a good majority of the country would say that they have a problem with people protesting for that, but it's, yeah, I mean, when you really believe in something, you know, it's human nature that you're willing to fight for it. It could have influenced other people to maybe try to bring violence in like a similar situation, like someone protesting something that they don't like. Well, okay, they got violent down there. Well, maybe you almost go into it expecting things to get violent.
Yeah.
That could definitely lead someone else somewhere, like, yeah, they could lead somebody else basically doing the same exact thing elsewhere in the country to convert to violence, which, yeah, it does play a role in that. Which, I mean, you asked about the media. That could also be, like, you could say that the media is maybe something that caused some of that, yeah, because of how much it covered it. My personal perspective about violence, yeah, it should be used when necessary. Mm-hmm. If I mean, in a situation I need to protect myself, or, I mean, yeah, maybe I'm with my girlfriend or my mother and something's going down where, yeah, if if you're going to force my hand, yeah, that's how it's going to, okay, that's how it's going to be. But I think it should be used only when necessary. I think in most situations, not using violence is the better course of action.
The people who were marching that day or at the rally were standing up for their opinion, their beliefs, and according to the Bill of Rights, they are allowed to do that, you know, stand up for what you believe in, free speech. I think that the white supremacists who came and they drove the car may believe that they were, you know, protected under the First Amendment, free speech, but personally, my interpretation of that is that you're allowed to have free speech and free practicing of your religion, free those basic rights, as long as it doesn't harm anyone. The president should have responded quicker and specifically name-called, you know, and said the keyword white supremacy in his tweets. That I think that that the fact that his statement was so haphazard, was so, I guess, politically motivated, when this type of situation is a human problem. It's something that doesn't need any of these weird political statements. It needs heartfelt emotion. It needs true caring, and I think that that was lacking in the president's response to this event. This event showed us that we have a lot of work to do as a nation. It showed us that we are not where we'd like to be, or at least where I think a nation like the United States, who is home of the brave, land of the free, should not have these types of incidents with white supremacy, that violence should be condemned. There is no gray area with violence. It either is violent or it is not. Personally, I hate violence, and that is super hypocritical of me to say because I know I conduct violence on a day-to-day basis. I hate it though. I hate that it's everywhere, that it's, you know, whether a kindergartner is telling her friend, I hate you, that's a type of, that's verbal violence, versus like actually like this Charlottesville incident with the white supremacy. I think that violence is any act that harms another individual, another organism, anything. So, and I don't think anyone wants to be harmed. I don't think that anyone wants to have that feeling of pain and suffering. I think that it is important that we understand that violence is not natural. It's something that, you know, one makes a choice to be violent, whether it be physical violence, mental violence, emotional violence, verbal violence. I think all of that is a conscious choice made by an individual to engage in it.
Everyone was so hesitant to call that a terrorist act, and even the president saying that there were good people on both sides of the protest, I don't think is correct, and I don't think it's fair. And I think a lot of what it does is normalize some of what for years has been sort of ideas and thoughts that were on the fringes of society, and now has kind of served to bring those back into the mainstream. I think the role that the media played in many cases was both good and bad. I think that a lot of major publications and newspapers were quick to label the acts of the white supremacist acts of violence, and were quick to condemn the acts of the protesters. I think that these people and these ideas for a while were sort of, condemned to the fringes of society. They were swept under the rug. But with the recent election, and especially the president's failure to condemn the thoughts and ideas around white nationalism and white supremacism for so long, has made some of these people feel like they now have a platform and they now have protection to spread what are racist and, in my opinion, deadly ideas in a way and on a stage where for years they haven't been able to. Violence is certainly rooted in a lot of the ideas that these people hold. And I think violence, while you'll see a lot of white supremacists say, oh, we just want, our own society void of any intermarriage, any racial mixing. But really, the only way to achieve what they want to achieve is through violence. So I think that while they try to underplay the role of violence in their movement and their ideas, I think it's central to everything that they want to accomplish. And when it can be avoided, I think that all measures should be taken to avoid serious and significant violence. However, I think it's also naive to think that, especially around such a hot-button issue, around an issue that's plagued society since, dating back hundreds, if not thousands of years, it's naive to think that violence is not a possibility and is not to be expected. You don't find racial cleansing or racial segregation highlighted or lauded in the Bible, but I think a lot of times you'll see groups like white nationalists sort of twist and mold religious texts to fit the ideas that they're trying to spread. And I think that's certainly the case in this movement, and I think that you've seen that throughout history as well.
I guess that makes it look a little worse, because when there's something that's involved religiously, there shouldn't be, there should never be violence with that. That's just people being disrespectful.
My religion is centered around nonviolence, and it is a huge component of our dogma that we believe in nonviolence. We don't harm even the littlest creature, and the fact that a violence of this magnitude of harming a human being was executed. Religiously, it is a tragedy. It's horrible that this happened, and I think most religions of the world, not most, all religions of the world condemn violence. So I don't think this is something that is specific to Jainism. It's everywhere, in every single religious practice, violence is condemned.
So, as you guys can see from the 3 interviews that we just conducted, each individual person had a very unique view based on the news source that they had primarily listened to for this Charlottesville riot and just general religion and violence. And when you look at Malzone, he primarily focused on Fox, and we saw that in his kind of left tilting viewpoint of the whole situation, focusing on, First Amendment rights, things of that nature, instead of kind of focusing on the rights skewing side of it, of more how terrible and racist those initial protesters were. And we had Noah as well, who was kind of definitely focused on that right side, and Rhea, who primarily listened to CNN, was more of an objective point of view, looking at both ends and giving us good information of the situation, both not only on the Charlottesville riots, but as well as her perception of violence and, in the end, both religion and violence. And that's one thing that we really wanted to focus on. We actually didn't expect, as we began this interview process, was even though all 3 of them had very different viewpoints on the Charlottesville riots and violence, when it came down to associating religion and violence, all three of them very staunchly were completely against associating the two. A few phrases that stuck out to us were disrespectful and unnecessary, and never associating the two unless there's a connotation of political gain or something like that. So as a whole, we saw this and we conducted what Grace is going to speak about, a further community discovery based off a wider reach other than just interviews.
So one thing that we decided to do was release a survey focused on 4 questions. How do you perceive the Charlottesville incident? I think, what is the first word or phrase that comes to mind with that? What is the first word or phrase that comes in mind when you think of violence in general? And also, what is the first word or phrase that comes to mind when you think of religious violence? And then we also asked what their news source is. And what is really interesting is, while in the discussion of either the Charlottesville violence or just violence in general, there was never a labeling of that violence being wrong. They might say that it's bad, it's harmful, even stupid to use for political gain, for example. But when it came to the religious violence, they explicitly said it is wrong several times. There were several responses, including that phrase. And one said that it was absolutely ridiculous and that religious violence is completely uncalled for. And something that I was able to relate this to is a quote that Zizek said in one of the articles that we read in class that reads, "It is even in the most universal ethics that we are not obliged to draw a line and ignore some sort of suffering." And I think that this directly relates to both Noah and Ria's responses, that it is naive to say that violence is not going to be incorporated into our everyday lives, and that we even ourselves will perpetrate that violence even in the smallest ways. We just selectively choose how to see this violence. And I think that we are constantly comparing violence in general to something that is a normal standard situation. And when you have the media presenting situations such as racial violence and protests, that becomes the standardized normal, and then something like religious violence is going to stick out as something truly immoral and wrong, and that's where you have that sort of differentiation between religious violence and violence in general in terms of people's perceptions of those and how that's influenced by the media.
Yeah, and then, as we started to see these results come together, Professor Mandera really helped us out, and he sent us a work that we focused in as well. It was called Religion, Media, and the Cultural Studies by Richard Fox. And what that started to talk about was the fact that throughout history, beginning with religion in particular, because of how big of an influence it had on people's lives, as media developed, it became more and more difficult to get your information from an original source in a way. As people copied and transcribed and relayed news to everyone, it became more and more influenced by those biases that people are perceiving. And that tied into a lot of what our project began to unfold in front of us and say, as we saw, as referenced in the work, a encoding and decoding of different hidden language but messages that people start to form in their own head and create these different perspectives and biases. And that media text, as they say, is the foundation of this. And the final takeaway from that reading that really helped tie things together was that the media imposes its classification of a lot of the social, cultural, political, and even religious perspectives onto the individuals that listen to it. And as we saw in our interviews and the research we conducted, there's such a wide array of perspectives that can be influenced by the source that you're gathering this info from. And we think that tied back very strongly to a lot of the core themes to this class, and had a very interesting time conducting our research. And hopefully you guys as well enjoyed the presentation, and we'd like to open the floor up for any questions about our research. Thanks.